Nerd Nite. Let's talk about stress, baby.
Okay, so I'm a grad student. I'm stressed a lot. I figure I might as well study it. But in particular, I'm really interested in how stress in a mother might affect her baby. But before I get to that question, I want to just talk about stress more generally. So Thursday night, we're all at a bar. Who was stressed this week? Yeah. What made you stressed? Work. What about work? Being on time? Yeah. Anyone have to meet with their boss? Have to give a presentation? Yeah. Okay, all of these things are very stressful. What do you feel in your body when you're stressed? Heart rate, yeah. Okay, awesome. So all of these things happen because of our HPA axis. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically it causes all these changes, including increasing our heart rate that allows oxygen to go throughout our body more quickly. It dilates our pupils so that we can kind of visualize everything in our environment better. It releases glucose from where it's stored so that our muscles can use it. And then it has more subtle things like affecting our immune system. It takes energy away from the immune system. And so do you remember if you have a really stressful week, maybe finals week in college, and you always seem to get a cold right after that? That's because your immune system is not doing quite as well. And then also, as you mentioned, when you're really stressed, you might get an upset stomach. And that's because the HPA axis also kind of neglects working with the digestive system. So all of these things happen because the HPA axis produces a hormone called cortisol. Now, I don't want you to think that cortisol is all bad. We all have some amount of cortisol in our body at any given time. But when we encounter a stressor, our body produces a whole lot more cortisol, and that elevated amount will remain there over the course of several minutes to hours. And cortisol is responsible for all the changes we see that result in our fight or flight response. And so this typically occurs under a very sudden stressor, like running into a bear, where you don't really need to worry about fighting off an illness or digesting your last meal if you're going to die in the next 10 seconds. So that is why cortisol has these effects. But this is kind of how cortisol works in us and all other animals. But obviously today, in our modern Western societies, we don't run into bears very often. Instead, we run into angry bosses. But it's the same HPA axis and the same hormone, cortisol, that is being activated in these scenarios. But if we think about what cortisol is really doing, it's changing how our body uses energy. It's a metabolic hormone. So it's taking energy to deal with this life or death threat and directing it away from our immune system or our digestive system. And so if we run into a threat, whether it be a bear or our boss, we immediately get an increase in cortisol. But since cortisol is really dealing with energy, it'll also respond to more long-term chronic stressors, like not having enough nutrition. So if you go on an intense diet and restrict your calorie intake to 1,200 calories a day, you will have an increase in your cortisol levels. Similarly, animals, if they have a wet season and a dry season in their environment where the amount of food available to them differs a lot, when they don't have much food, they'll also have higher levels of cortisol. Another example would be if you have a really physically demanding lifestyle or job, like this Amazon worker. So they might be getting a good amount of nutrition, but the physical demands on their body every single day is causing them to have an increased level of cortisol as well. So I'm interested not just in what happens when there's high cortisol levels in anybody, but what happens if there's high levels of cortisol in a mother, and does it affect her baby? So this has been studied a lot in laboratory rodents. So here's a rat mom with her pups, and in the lab, they'll stress the moms out during pregnancy, and what they find is that they give birth to offspring that are small. The mother then provides worse care for her offspring, so she doesn't nurse them as much, she doesn't lick or groom them as much either. And then lastly, when those offspring grow up, they themselves are more anxious. If they are exposed to some type of stressor, then they will release more cortisol than another rat. So there's been a few studies looking at this in humans, and we've kind of found similar results. So if mothers have high levels of cortisol during pregnancy, their babies are also born small. And in the medical community, low birth weight is a very strong predictor of individuals developing diabetes, obesity, or cardiovascular disease later in life. So all in all, this doesn't seem very good. But I don't want to stress people out here. So Sarah, you don't need to worry about these effects, because for us, going into a stressful meeting or something, that's a very short-term stressor. What I'm talking about here is extreme long-term stressors. So one of the main examples of this in humans is the Dutch hunger winter. So that's when the Nazis occupied the Netherlands and they set up a blockade in the winter of 1944 and 45. And during that time, adults were rationed as little as 580 calories per day. Yeah, somehow those women managed to give birth still, but what they found is that their offspring exhibited all of these negative effects. So far, having high levels of cortisol during pregnancy seems bad. But biologists and ecologists were thinking, well, why did this evolve in the first place? So in mammals, we have the placenta, and that is meant to protect the fetus from anything bad going on in the mom's body. So why would the placenta allow cortisol to get through if it was simply bad for the baby? So biologists started looking at the effects of maternal stress in wild animals to see if there might be any benefit to having high maternal stress. So this is a red squirrel. Dr. Ben Dancer, who's also at the University of Michigan, studies these in the Yukon in Canada. And these squirrels all have their own territory. They live by themselves. And pups stay with their mom in the nest for a few months before they have to go and get their own territory. So what they found is that in general, pups grow at this typical rate. But when mothers were placed in a more crowded environment and they had more competitors around them, they had high levels of cortisol. And then they gave birth to pups that were small, as we talked about before, but those pups then grew faster after birth. And so then when it came time for the pups to leave the nest and go and get their own territory, the larger ones would be more likely to gain a territory. And if you don't get a territory, by the time winter comes around, you will probably die. So this is just one example where cortisol seems to actually be beneficial for the offspring. We think that the mother is telling the offspring about the environment it's going to be born into, saying it's really competitive, you need to take your energy and you need to invest it all in growth so that you can win a territory. Okay, so we have these cool results in wild animals, but I'm really interested in how this might relate to humans. But obviously rodents and humans are not very closely related. So these pups become adults by the time they're a year old. Humans obviously take a lot longer than that. So I, in my research, am kind of trying to connect these two sides by looking still at a wild animal, but at a monkey, which develops along the same time frame as humans. So I studied Gelada monkeys. They live in the highlands of Ethiopia. Our study site is the Simien Mountains National Park, which is in the north of the country, that black dot up there. Our research group has been studying them for about 13 years now. So all the monkeys have names, and we know who's related to who. And that's the house that we live in when we're there. And we also have a small lab there where we can start processing hormone samples. And if you're wondering how we measure cortisol in a monkey, we do it by collecting their poop. So I spend a lot of my time waiting for a monkey to poop. It's really glamorous. So I've been out to Ethiopia twice so far, and I'm actually about to head out again in a few weeks for a full year to get the rest of my data. So my first question is, what even causes high cortisol levels in a gelada? What stresses them out? So I'll tell you a bit more about geladas. They live in the Ethiopian highlands, which is a really challenging environment. It's very high altitude at just over 2 miles high, so that's twice as high as Denver. They live in reproductive units. The fluffy big one there would be the male, and then he has several females in his unit and their dependent offspring. They're very social for a primate, so you can see in these photos there's multiple units all together, and they will spend the entire day together foraging, and then they'll go down the cliffs together to sleep. And we think the reason geladas are so social for a primate is because they mostly eat grass. They're graminivorous. And so that's a very widely available resource, and so they don't have to be very competitive, and they don't have to fight each other off of territories. Okay, so I wanted to know what drives stress or cortisol in geladas. And so the first thing I looked at is rank. So within these reproductive groups, females have a hierarchy among themselves. And the high-ranking females are very aggressive, and they'll steal food from the low-ranking females. And so we determine rank by looking at their interactions. And one of the things we look at is how often they threaten one another. So a threat is when they raise their eyebrows and they go, hey. And in this female here is doing that to me in this photo. So in Gelada society, humans are the lowest ranking individuals. So what I found is that low-ranking females have significantly higher levels of cortisol throughout all of pregnancy, mostly during the first trimester, but it remains above that of high-ranking individuals throughout pregnancy. And then on top of that, low-ranking females who are pregnant in the dry season have the highest levels of cortisol of any other monkey. So geladas live in this very seasonal environment. On the left, you see a picture in the wet season. There's lots of green grass. That's their favorite food. But then half of the year is this dry season where there's absolutely no green grass. What the female's doing in this picture is digging for tubers. It takes a lot more time to get food. And this is the season when females will steal food from the low-ranking females. Okay, so that answers my first question. Next, I want to know, how does the mother's cortisol affect her care towards her baby? So I don't have data on this yet, but this is what I'm going out to collect this year. I'm going to be looking at how often a mother nurses or grooms her infant. I want to know whether high cortisol makes them do less of this behavior, which is what we saw in laboratory rodents. I also want to know how often they carry their infant around. So geladas will travel a few kilometers each day when they're foraging on the plateau. And this baby in the bottom left is probably about 4 or 5 months old, and it's pretty typical for them to be carried at that age. But this baby in the middle is closer to a year, and you can see there that he's pretty close in size to his mother, maybe about like a fourth or a fifth of her size. So that would be like you carrying around your 10-year-old. It's pretty exhausting. And so I'm also going to look at until what age do they carry their infant around. And then lastly, I'm going to look at distance. Is the mother very protective? Does she immediately go and get her infant if it goes, 2 feet away? Kind of like a parent who keeps a leash on their kid. Or is she more chill, doesn't really care? This infant, Mocha, was about 3 or 4 months old when I took this photo, and her mom never cared about where she was. I would be with her mom for 15 minutes at a time, observing her behavior, and I would never see Mocha during that time. And I would be more concerned about where Mocha was than the mom was. And to be fair, this was her mom's 5th infant, so maybe she was kind of just tired of it all. Okay, and then lastly, I want to know what happens to the offspring that are born to mothers with high levels of cortisol. So again, this is what I'm going out to collect data on, but I'm going to be looking to see if offspring that experienced high levels of cortisol develop more quickly or more slowly in different factors related to control offspring. So I'm going to be looking at how quickly they grow. We take photos of the monkeys every couple of months, and we use a parallel laser camera that's set to exactly 4 centimeters apart. So then in the photo, we can calculate how long their shoulder rump length is. I'm also going to look at how quickly they develop motor skills. So geladas have to jump over a lot of ravines. They have to climb up steep cliffs. So I want to know at what age do infants start to be able to do those things. So I'm going to look at what age can they climb a tree, can they do a cartwheel, things like that. And then lastly, I'm going to see at what age do they reach independence. So we're going to look at when they stop breastfeeding from the mom. So when are they nutritionally independent from the mom. Okay, so just to sum up, so far I have found that being a low-ranking female and being pregnant during the dry season results in high levels of cortisol for a Gelada mom. And now going forward, I want to know if high levels of cortisol impair maternal care and if they affect offspring developmental rates. Okay, so I want to say thank you to Live, the library, Nerd Nite in general, all of you guys for your patience. That was really great. Our whole field team, the Ethiopian Wildlife Conservation Authority, and of course the monkeys.
This program was recorded on August 15th, 2019 at Live, 102 South 1st Street